This is a very exciting episode for me because I know that no matter how much you might have a passion for the job you're pursuing, and no matter how awesome the company is that you're hoping to go work for, the thing that's on each one of your minds is, how can I make the most money possible in my new role? Well, in today's episode, I'll be sharing an insider's perspective on how to effectively manage salary negotiations once you've been extended a formal offer of employment, with the goal of giving you the confidence and know-how to ask for more money while also helping you avoid the embarrassment of asking for too much money and coming across as amateurish or unreasonable. This will be a master class in the art of salary negotiation. I help frustrated job seekers successfully navigate the job search and interview process. My name is Mark Williamson, and I'm the head of talent acquisition for a leading U.S. company. Stick with me throughout this episode as I discuss the ins and outs of the counteroffer after you've received an initial formal job offer for a full-time position. Now, the operative words there are formal job offer, which means a written job offer. You will not submit a counter offer to a verbal job offer. So this is only after you've received that written offer. So please keep that in mind as you go through the offer process. And in case you're wondering if I've got experience with roles like the one you're pursuing, my current recruiting team hires for positions in the following areas: administrative, customer service, tech support, desktop support, finance and accounting, marketing, inside sales, outside sales, software engineering, software architects, UX, UI, Salesforce, Microsoft Dynamics, quality assurance, business intelligence, project management, program management, training, instructional design, HR, legal, corporate development, as well as executive level positions, amongst others. Now let's discuss the components that could be a part of a full-time job offer. They are an hourly wage or an annual salary. Now, if you're pursuing a sales role, some sales positions are 100% commission and do not have an hourly wage or an annual salary as part of the package. Next, some offers will include an annual bonus. This could be monthly, quarterly, or yearly, and totally depends on the company and or the position. The next component of an offer could be a sign-on bonus, and we'll get into sign-on bonuses a little bit later in the episode and talk a little bit deeper about how those work. The next component could be a sales commission, and this is sometimes guaranteed for a certain period of time for certain salespeople. The thinking there is that it takes a while to ramp up and to get acclimated to the territory and to the customer base. So there's going to be a period of time for salespeople where they're not making sales. So a lot of companies will guarantee a certain portion of the commission in order to entice that salesperson to take the role and gut it out until they can get things moving in the territory. The next component of the offer could be what a lot of companies refer to as LTIP, which is LTIP, and that stands for long-term incentive plan. Now, the long-term incentive plan is essentially a stock offering as part of the job offer, and you'll usually see that in early stage companies or private companies who have a possibility to go public or who could potentially get bought. There's value over the long haul in having stock, so you'll often see LTIP be a part of the package. But again, LTIP is usually reserved for certain levels of roles. So not everybody will have LTIP, and we'll get a little bit deeper into the stock component here a little bit later. And then the other piece that could be a part of the offer is a relocation package. This could be in the form of a sign-on bonus, or it could be a full-fledged reload package that has, numerous facets to it, which we'll talk about a little bit later as well. And then finally, most offers will have some sort of standard benefits package that's a part of the offer. And this could include PTO or personal time off, healthcare coverage, which would include healthcare, dental, and vision coverage. It could also include a 401k match program. Insurance coverage is also usually a part of the standard benefits package, and that could include life insurance, long-term disability, and short-term disability. You could also have a health savings plan as part of the standard benefits package, which allows you to contribute a certain amount pre-tax into a fund that then is used for you to pay for your various healthcare costs over the course of the year. There are also nowadays, many companies are offering mental health resources as part of the standard benefits package. And then some companies are doing company giving resources where the company will match charity donations if you decide to contribute to your favorite charity. Now, before you get too excited, thinking that there is negotiating room for every job at every level, that's simply not the case. And the one thing that I am with you guys in these episodes is real. So I'm going to shoot you straight. First of all, if the recruiter has told you during the interview process that they pay everyone in the role you're interviewing for a set amount, and that amount is X, then believe them. Recruiters are not asked to lie or act like a used car salesman when it comes to how they handle salary discussions. So if the set amount the recruiter tells you the position pays doesn't work for you, remove yourself from the process early on. Now, don't confuse set amount with target amount. A set amount is when the recruiter says, we pay all newly hired customer service representatives $18 an hour. That's a set amount. On the other hand, a target amount is when the recruiter says, we have a targeted salary of $75K for this role. A targeted salary usually means there is still room for negotiation, but for some reason the company has said ideally the salary would be this amount. Now, before we get into how to submit a counteroffer and how to actually negotiate after you receive an offer, let's discuss what a typical offer could look like across a variety of compensation scenarios. We'll also discuss the various aspects of the offer and what room, if any, there is for negotiation in each scenario. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to talk through 5 different levels of compensation and the associated components of an offer for those levels of positions that are generally associated with those comp levels. And then we'll just talk about what negotiating room there is or isn't for each of those scenarios. So first, let's talk about the hourly position. So if you're interviewing for an hourly job, that could be a customer service rep role, it could be an administrative role, or a number of other hourly positions that exist out there. Generally speaking, for an hourly job, right, first and foremost, most hourly positions, especially if they're, say, under, $20 and below, there is usually no room for negotiating the hourly rate for roles such as that. Now, I'll caveat that by saying that if the position is a part of a high volume of roles that's being hired for lots of similar or like positions, such as customer service, those are the scenarios where the company usually will not budge on the hourly rate. So if it's a part of a volume of hires, a number of positions are being hired just like the one you're being interviewed for, there's likely not a chance that you can negotiate that offer. And again, that's usually positions that are $20 an hour and below. But what other components are usually a part of an offer for an hourly role? Well, there's usually no sign-on bonus associated with those types of roles. Now, again, I'll caveat that by saying there are a few exceptions to this, right? Sometimes companies are struggling to fill a certain type of position, even if it's an hourly position. They may be, maybe it's a highly competitive area for customer service positions. And, maybe company X wants to try and entice customer service reps from another reputable company in the area. And so maybe they offer something like a $500 sign-on bonus if you join the company, maybe even $1,000 or $1,500 sign-on bonus. But generally speaking, most hourly roles do not have a sign-on bonus associated with it, but that could differ depending on if there's a special circumstance. Next, let's talk about annual bonus. Most companies who hire hourly workers usually don't offer an annual bonus as part of the hourly role. Now, having said that, the company I currently work for does offer an annual bonus for our hourly workers. And that amount is a 5% bonus. So some companies certainly can and do offer bonuses, annual bonuses for hourly roles. But most companies, I would say, do not, because I've worked at several other companies who had hourly employees and they were not eligible for an annual bonus. Now, next, let's talk about stock. For an hourly worker, unless you're working for a startup company, and I'm talking probably an early stage startup company that's less than 2 or 3 years old, you are not going to be offered stock as an hourly worker. But at startup companies, I've seen stranger things, and many startup companies offer everyone stock. So, we'll talk about how to handle that a little bit later as well. Now, again, let's talk about whether or not the salary or any of those components of salary that we just talked about are negotiable. And the answer is no. For an hourly worker, salary is usually not negotiable at all, especially at the $20 and below level. Now, if you're an hourly worker who may be going into a one-off type job, but it happens to pay hourly. So, for example, on my team, I have 2 people of my total team that are hourly. And when we hired those 2 people, we had X amount that we were paying. And, it was a number that we put together based on some market insights. But, had one of the people said, hey, that's, $2 or $3 below what I was hoping per hour, right? I did have some room to move and negotiate on that. But again, those are one-off positions that are not part of a high volume of roles that a company might be hiring. So next, let's talk through the next level of hire, which is someone who's making less than $50,000 annually, but they are salaried, not hourly. Now, generally speaking, for someone in that 50K or less range, there is an opportunity to potentially get a sign-on bonus. It just depends. But usually the sign-on bonus is going to be a smaller bonus, right? You're talking 2 to 5K potentially, if your scenario warrants it. And also, you'll likely, if the company offers an annual bonus, you'll likely have a set percentage of an annual bonus that's a part of the package. And then again, stock is usually not a part of the package in this situation. Again, unless you're a part of an early stage startup. Is the offer negotiable? Maybe, right? Less than 50K, right? If someone's hiring you at $38,000 for some sort of role and it happens to be salaried, if you needed 40K to make it work, yeah, there's probably a 2K opportunity to negotiate, but there's not a 10K opportunity in a role like this, right? So as I said early on, you're probably talking 2 to 5K is what your negotiating room is. Probably more like 2 to 3K is realistic. All right, so the next category we'll talk about is those in the 50 to 75K scenario. In that range of salary, you do have an opportunity potentially to get a sign-on bonus, probably somewhere in the 5 to 10K range. It all depends, again, on if you've got a business case for that, and we'll talk about that a little bit here later. As far as an annual bonus goes, there's a set percentage that a company would potentially offer someone in the 50 to 75K range. And then stock, highly unlikely, unless, again, early stage startup. And then is the offer negotiable? Yes, the offer is somewhat negotiable there. You're probably talking 5 to 8K negotiating room if you're in that 50 to 75K range. All right, so next, let's jump into the 75 to 150K range. So now you're getting into, a little bit more of the manager and the highly paid individual contributor roles. So again, sign-on bonuses are a realistic part of the offer potentially if you've got a business case for it. And you're talking probably a sign-on bonus that could be somewhere between 10 and 20K. Again, set annual bonus is usually set in stone per the company's policy, and they'll tell you what the percentage is. Stock, again, highly unlikely unless you're at an early stage startup. But there's certainly a few scenarios at private companies and or publicly traded companies where they may offer someone in the 75 to 150K range some stock. Is this offer negotiable? Absolutely. If you're in the 75 to 150K range, you're probably looking at a 10 to 15K window of negotiating room, depending on, again, if you've got some valid reasons why you feel the role should pay a little bit more. So next, let's talk about the next range, which is 150K to 200K base salary. Now you're getting into serious territory here, right? And so I would say if you've got a decent business case, you should expect a sign-on bonus in the 150K to 200K salary range, right? And that sign-on bonus is usually going to be somewhere between that 15K to 50K range, is what you're probably looking at. Again, you'll have a set annual bonus in a role like this. Stock is a maybe, right? Depending on the type of company. Early stage startup, absolutely. Private company, you've got a good shot. Publicly traded company, just depends on how long the company's been around. If you're talking about Ford Motor Company or somebody that's been around for God knows how many years, probably not giving out stock to a director who's coming in at 150 or 60K. But private company, you probably would have an opportunity to get something. It just depends on the company. And then again, is that offer negotiable? Absolutely. You're probably talking a 10 to 25K window of negotiating for that type of role. You've got that sort of range to negotiate within. But again, you can't negotiate just for the sake of negotiating. There has to be a set of reasons why you're asking for more money. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. Now, finally, let's talk about that 200 to 250K mark and potentially up from there, right? Now, in that scenario, you're absolutely looking at a sign-on bonus. The only reason I would say you might not get a sign-on bonus in this salary range is if you were out of work, sitting on the sidelines for 6 months to a year or something, and then, maybe you were laid off and, took time off, and then you pursued an opportunity. If there's no incentive for the company to pay you a sign-on bonus, they're not just going to do it to do it. Now, some companies will, but most companies have to have a reason for paying a sign-on bonus. As far as annual bonus goes, again, another set percentage, which will be per company policy. Stock, highly likely. And then is the offer negotiable? For sure. You've probably got 15 to 25K room to negotiate there. Right? Think about it, right? If the offer was 250, you could potentially negotiate that up to say 275. So 25K negotiating room is a pretty good number, in a scenario like this. So that's sort of the range of compensation for various roles and sort of what a comp package could look like and what negotiating room you potentially have there. Now, some of you may be thinking, I thought there was way more money to be had than the numbers you've mentioned so far, Mark. And maybe you thought, it's nothing for a company to come up 20K or 30K on a 90K offer, for example. Well, there are two things that control how much salary a company is willing or able to offer. The first is called internal equity. Internal equity refers to the salaries that employees already working for the company currently make. And companies are very careful about paying new hires too far outside of the average of what others already in the company doing the same job you're being hired to do currently make. Imagine if the average salary inside the company for a senior accountant, for example, was 90K. And they hired you from the outside and paid you 30K more and gave you 120K. If the word got out to the other senior accountants, there would be a coup. I mean, just think about it. If the average salary for a senior accountant is 90K, that means some people are making, say, 83K, some are making 87K. Some make 90K, some might make 95K. But paying someone from the outside 30K more would cause others to quit if they found out, or they would go to HR and put pressure on the company to raise their salary to 120K. Or even worse, it could result in an unequal pay lawsuit, especially if the person who received the 120K was a non-minority. And all the minorities in the company are paid 20 to 30K less on average. So good companies ensure that anyone working in the same role is paid within a reasonable range of the others, no matter what their race or gender. Now, again, let's be clear. That doesn't mean everyone makes the same amount. There's always going to be different amounts paid to different people. But again, you can't go sue a company because, you're in the same role as someone and you make 87K and they make 91K, right? There's various reasons for why someone else may be paid a little more than you. They may have a different educational background, different job experience, different number of years of experience, or maybe they've been with the company longer, and gotten a raise here or there. So, but if it was, a 25K difference and you're doing the exact same job, that's when companies have to worry. The other thing that affects how much a company can offer during salary negotiation is the fact that, contrary to popular belief, companies do not have treasure troves of money just laying around for the taking when it comes to salary negotiation. Rather, most companies have strict budgeting processes, and the money allocated for salaries is pretty well controlled. Now, that's not to say there's no room for negotiating. However, if you thought that companies just have the ability to throw money around, it's just not the case. Companies usually have a compensation specialist who prices the position according to benchmarking data that tells them what similar sized companies with similar numbers of employees and similar revenue numbers pay for a particular position. Note that I said similarly sized companies. I mention this because it's often the case that job candidates forget that not all companies are created equal. A company like Amazon, for example, with revenues well over $100 billion, may have drastic pay differences compared to, say, a $500 million company. To bring this point home, I once interviewed a guy for a senior director position in the technology organization for the company I was working for, and we were paying $275K base salary plus a 35% annual bonus for the role. Well, the guy told me during our initial interview that his base salary was currently $550,000, and with his bonus, he made over $800K per year. And I don't remember which one, but I think he worked for either Qualcomm, which is like a $44 billion company, or Oracle, which is a $43 billion company. So he was working for a big time company. And so he was looking for a similar salary from us. But the company I worked for was a $5 billion company. Again, nothing to sneeze at, but certainly not a $44 billion company. And the only people in our company who made those types of salaries, i.e. $500,000 base salary and up, were the CEO, the CFO, the COO, the CHRO, and potentially our head general counsel. So, he was just barking up the wrong company tree. So I had to basically tell him, unfortunately, we can't move forward because we don't have the ability to meet your salary expectations. So how do you make a counteroffer if you feel the offer is not quite where you think it should be? Now, first of all, understand that just because you make a counteroffer doesn't mean you'll get what you're asking for. So prepare yourself mentally to possibly have to either accept the initial offer or walk away. But if you do indeed feel like a counteroffer is the way to go, here is how to handle it. Number one, you should negotiate the counteroffer directly with the recruiter, not the hiring manager. Now, that doesn't mean the hiring manager is not going to see the counteroffer. But what I mean by that is, as far as the back and forth discussion about it, that should be done with the recruiter. The recruiter will ultimately have to get the hiring manager's approval for any new offer terms, but the back and forth, again, should be done through the recruiter. So to kick things off, send the recruiter and the hiring manager. So copy the hiring manager on the email. And if the HR business partner was also a part of the offer email, copy him or her as well. So to kick things off, send all of those individuals an email expressing thanks for the offer you've received. And say that you'd like to take a day or two to look over the offer terms and get back to them with your thoughts. After you've had a chance to review the offer in its entirety, put together a list of bullet points outlining where the gaps are in the offer and what your counter offer terms will include. Next, send an email to just the recruiter asking for a brief call to discuss the offer. When you get on the call with the recruiter, again, express your appreciation for the offer you received, but let him or her know that you have a couple of concerns with some of the offer terms, and you would like their advice and guidance as it relates to possibly submitting a counteroffer. Then walk them through your counteroffer bullet points. Now, while you're doing this, take the pulse of the recruiter during the conversation to determine whether or not your counteroffer points will be well received by the company and or the hiring manager. If you got a good feeling from the discussion with the recruiter, tell him or her that you plan on sending an email to the hiring manager, copying the recruiter, containing your formal counteroffer and a summary of why you're asking for what you're asking for. Now keep the following in mind: benefits, PTO, annual bonus, and sales commissions are usually set in stone and are not negotiable. You don't know how many times I've had people come during the offer process, especially director and above, who typically I will handle those offers myself. They think they can negotiate time off or benefits, and it's just not the case. Companies have strict policies around those things, and they don't really have a good mechanism for adjusting those things for one person versus the other. So they're usually set in stone. Now, the other thing to keep in mind is you should have a valid reason for asking for whatever you're asking for in the counter offer. It can't just be because you feel you should make more money. You need to justify it on paper. Hence that email that I said you're going to send back. So good reasons for asking for an increased hourly rate or base salary include things like you're looking for a minimum of 15% increase over your current salary, and the current offer doesn't satisfy that. Or your bonus percentage is decreasing, so you would like to offset this with a higher salary. Or based on the responsibilities of the role, the complexity of the upcoming projects, or other work requirements, you feel that the offer should be at a higher salary to account for this. Next, let's discuss good reasons for asking for a sign-on bonus. So one reason to ask for a sign-on bonus is if they were unable to meet your base salary expectations. And so in order to offset a lower base salary, you can say, hey, I have valid reasons for why I felt like the base salary should have been, X amount. If we're unable to come to that, potentially a sign-on bonus in the range of X could make up for that and allow me to feel better about accepting the role. Now, again, if the recruiter has told you that the base salary cannot move, that's when you potentially counter with a sign-on bonus to offset the base salary. But if the recruiter hadn't said that the base salary is set in stone or something, before asking for a sign-on bonus to offset the base salary, you should counter with a higher base salary. The next reason why you might be asking for a sign-on bonus is to make up for lost bonuses due to leaving your current company before bonus payouts have occurred. So if you think about it, most companies will pay bonuses on an annual basis, and therefore they usually pay them in March or April of the year after you've worked to earn the bonus. And a lot of them have policies that say you must still be with the company at the time bonuses are paid in order to get your bonus. So imagine if you left the company in July, that means you've worked January through June, and you're going to walk away from those 6 months of bonus potential. So companies will often write a signing bonus in order to make up for the 6 months or 8 months of bonus that you wouldn't get because you wouldn't get those months of service at the new company. So that's a valid reason to ask for a sign-on bonus. Another reason to ask for a sign-on bonus is to make up for a lost retention bonus. Now, what's a retention bonus? Oftentimes companies will say, hey, we really appreciate the work you're doing here. Maybe we haven't been having the greatest year, so, bonuses may be down this year. Well, if you stick it out with us and stay with us through August, there's a little bit of a pot of gold waiting for you in August. We're willing to give you a $25,000 retention bonus for persevering through the tough times. And so if you decide to leave that organization who has dangled a retention bonus and you leave before the bonus is paid, you could say to the new company, hey, I have a retention bonus on the table, and I'd like, to see if we can offset that with a sign-on bonus because I'd be walking away from that. And many companies will accommodate that. The other reason would be, to ask for a sign-on bonus could be to offset a required bonus payback. Now, what do I mean by that? Let's say you relocated to join a company, and that's the company you're working for, and maybe they had a 2-year clawback clause that said if you leave in less than 2 years, you owe us back, whatever the relocation amount was on a prorated basis, right? Well, if that's the case, you could ask the new company, hey, I have to pay back a reload bonus if I leave now. Is there any way you can offer a sign-on bonus to help me offset that? The other reason would be that even if you didn't get a relocation bonus, maybe you got a sign-on bonus to join the company you currently work for. And if that's the case, again, it often comes with a clawback clause of at least 12 months, sometimes 2 years, that say, hey, we gave you a $30,000 sign-on. You're obligated to work here for the next 2 years, or else you've got to pay us that back on a prorated basis. So again, you may have to produce some documentation that proves that was in your offer letter, but most companies would take you for your word for it. But that's a valid reason. Now, another reason to potentially ask for a sign-on bonus is simply to sweeten the offer and make it worth your while to take the job. I mean, especially if you have other competing offers, right? You don't have to be shy about it. You can say to the recruiter and the hiring manager, hey, I really like your company and really love this role and think I can add value. But just in full transparency, right? In my attempt to find my next home, I've been talking to 2 or 3 other companies, and one of those companies have extended me an offer. It's a very competitive offer compared to yours. Is there any way you can offer a sign-on bonus or something to sweeten the offer? I'd really like to take your offer, but right now their offer is either a little better or whatever the case may be. And companies don't like to lose out to other companies. And so, again, it all depends on the level of position you're interviewing for, right? The more senior the role, the more room they have to negotiate, and the more willing they are probably to negotiate and offer a sign-on bonus. Again, if you're talking about a $50K job, the company's not going to come way up to compete with another offer. I mean, they might move up $2,000 to $3,000 or something, but that's about it, as I said earlier. So you've just got to play that by ear and, act accordingly. And then finally, the last reason that you might ask for a sign-on bonus is if the company is requiring that you relocate for the position, but is unwilling to offer a full relocation package. If that's the case, then ask for a sign-on bonus of $15,000 to $25K to assist you in the move. And companies will often do this. Now, usually this is going to be for a manager level role or above, or potentially a highly paid technical role or individual contributor role. But you have the right to ask for a sign-on bonus if they're not willing to offer a full relocation package. And if you're interviewing for a manager and above position, right, especially one that pays $150K or more, and the position requires you to relocate for the job, you should ask for a full relocation package as part of the offer. Now, the recruiter will likely have told you early on in the process whether the position requires relocation and whether the company plans on offering a reload package. So you should know this early on. It should not be a surprise whether reload is a part of the equation for you. One note about a relocation package, right? So, in case you've never dealt with these, a full relocation package is pretty robust, and it usually includes movers, packing, and shipping your household goods, the shipment of one or two cars. Usually it's two cars because they know you probably have a spouse potentially or a partner, and you may have more than one car in the household. It will also, oftentimes include realtor assistance on the sale and purchase of a house. It could include temporary lodging allowance during the move, as well as money for incidentals and other unexpected costs like setting up utilities, etc. I've received two full relocation packages over the course of my career, and they are amazing if you can get them. Finally, what about stock? Now, if you're interviewing with a publicly traded company and you feel that your position level warrants stock, or if your research has shown that the company normally offers stock to employees, ask the recruiter early on whether stock is a possibility. Based on their answer, you should determine whether stock should be a part of negotiations. A former recruiter on one of my previous teams recently joined Walmart as an individual contributor recruiter, and he was offered stock. So you never know. Now, if you're interviewing for a VP level position or higher, you will likely have stock included in your offer. If you're interviewing with a private company or an early stage startup company, you should definitely ask about stock. The answer may be no, but if you can get stock at one of these companies, you could stand to make a ton of money over time. In fact, a buddy of mine who lives in Nashville, way back in the day, he was dating this woman. He met her at a bar and asked her out. They hit it off. And I remember him telling me this story. My buddy was very well paid at the time. He was in a role where I think he was making $350,000 base salary. He probably made another $250 to $300 in annual bonus. He worked for an Australian company in commercial real estate, but he worked in Nashville running their hotel building business, and then he moved on to run their medical office building business, right? But so he was a very well-off individual. He lived the finest of lifestyles. He drank, expensive bottles of wine. He spared no expense. And so when he met this particular woman at a bar and he asked her out, she said, sure. And so a week or so later, she gave him her address and he was driving out to pick her up from her house. And so he said he was driving to get to her house. And as he was driving, he kept going, deeper and deeper into the hills of Tennessee. And the houses just kept getting bigger and on more land and just amazing houses. And so he finally got to the top of the hill where this woman lived and he parked in her driveway. And he said he was, parked in front of this humongous that probably had to be, 6,500 square foot house that was a, modern lodge, looked like it was brand new, just this amazing sprawling house. And so he goes to the door and he knocks on the door, rings the doorbell, and she comes to the door and she says, I'm still getting ready. So he came in the house and was hanging out while she was still getting ready. He's just looking around. He said, he thought he was balling. He at the time was living in probably a $800,000 townhouse, downtown Nashville, BMW, he had it all, but he all of a sudden felt small, standing in her great room. Right. And so finally, when she came out, he asked her, he says, I just got to ask you. He goes, this is an amazing house, right? You told me you're single, you've never been married, what's going on here? Am I missing something? Do you come from money? And she told him, she said, I was employee number, I think it was like number 30 at a pharmaceutical company I can't remember the name of the pharma company, but they were a pharma company who made cancer drugs, right? And so she said she was like employee number 30, and they were an early stage startup pharma company. And when she joined, they gave her stock options. And she said, after having been with the company for something like 8 years, the company went public and her stock options turned into $12 million. So she said she cashed out her stock and built that house. And she's a multimillionaire as a result of getting stock by going to work for an early stage startup. You've got to just learn how to interview.